The dining room was bathed in golden candlelight, the soft clinking of silverware against fine china echoing in the grand estate. A long mahogany table stretched between two people, a father and his son. The air was thick, laced with the scent of rosemary and slow-roasted meat, yet something about this evening felt wrong. James Caldwell, a man of power and prestige, sat at the head of the table. A self-made millionaire, he was used to having control over his businesses, his home, and even his family. Tonight, however, that control was slipping, though he didn't know it yet. His sharp blue eyes studied his plate, then flickered toward his son, Nathan, who sat eerily still across from him. Nathan, just 16, had always looked up to his father. Despite the distance wealth had created between them, he admired the man who built an empire from nothing. But tonight, admiration had been replaced by fear. His fingers trembled as he gripped his fork, his heart hammering in his chest. He had seen something that changed everything. A moment earlier, as he passed the kitchen on his way to the dining room, he had seen his mother, Evelyn, standing over his father's plate. Her hands moved quickly, too quickly, as she sprinkled something into the steaming food. She had turned sharply, eyes wide, before schooling her expression into the usual calm mask she wore. But Nathan saw it, the flicker of panic, the hesitation. And in that moment he knew. Now seated before his father, he felt the weight of the truth pressing down on him like an unbearable force. His father picked up his knife, cutting into the perfectly cooked steak. The movement was slow, deliberate. Nathan's pulse spiked. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad," his voice shook. "Don't eat that." James frowned, mid-bite, his fork hovering just inches from his mouth. "What?" Nathan's gaze darted toward the kitchen door, his heart hammering so loudly he could barely hear himself speak. He took a deep breath, and before he could talk himself out of it, whispered, "Mother put poison in your dinner." For a moment, everything stopped. The world seemed to freeze around them. The flickering candlelight, the faint hum of the chandelier overhead, the distant sound of the butler clearing dishes in the next room. All of it faded. James stared at his son, his face unreadable. Then slowly he placed his fork down, his jaw tightening. "What did you just say?" His voice was dangerously low, edged with something Nathan couldn't quite place: disbelief, anger, or maybe even fear. Nathan's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. He could feel his mother's presence now, just outside the room. She hadn't entered yet, but she was there, waiting, listening. James turned his gaze toward the doorway, his expression darkening. Evelyn had always been composed, graceful, the perfect wife to a powerful man. But if what Nathan saw was true, then everything they believed about her was a lie. A heavy silence settled over them, stretching unbearably long. Then with a slow inhale, James pushed back his chair, the soft scrape of wood against the floor breaking the stillness. Nathan's breath caught. Was his father about to confront her? Was he about to dismiss his warning as childish imagination? Or worse, was it already too late? The kitchen door creaked open. Evelyn stepped inside. Her lips curved into a gentle smile, but her eyes held something else. Something cold. "Is everything all right?" she asked sweetly. And in that moment, Nathan knew his warning had come too late. James didn't move. His eyes were locked onto Evelyn, his face unreadable. The weight of Nathan's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Evelyn's smile remained, but there was something behind it now, a sharpness, as if she sensed the shift in the room. Nathan could barely breathe. His father hadn't reacted yet, hadn't said a word, and the uncertainty made his skin crawl. Did he believe him? Did he think he was lying? His mother stood just a few steps away, watching, waiting. If she knew what Nathan had told him, she wasn't showing it. James finally leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. His voice was calm, too calm. "Nathan says you did something to my dinner." Evelyn's smile didn't falter. Instead, she let out a soft, breathy laugh, shaking her head as if amused by the absurdity of the statement. "Did something?" she echoed, tilting her head slightly. "What on earth is he talking about?" Nathan's pulse pounded. He could feel his mother's gaze shift toward him, studying him like a puzzle she had yet to solve. Her eyes, dark and unreadable, locked onto his, and for a brief moment, he swore he saw something flicker behind them, something dangerous. "I saw you," Nathan forced out, his voice tight. "In the kitchen. You put something in Dad's food." Evelyn sighed, stepping closer. "Sweetheart, that's ridiculous." She chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "You must have imagined something. Maybe the steam, or the seasoning." Nathan pushed back his chair abruptly, the legs scraping against the floor. "I know what I saw," he snapped. His heart was racing now, his body tense like a wire ready to snap. He turned to James, desperation in his voice. "Dad, don't eat it. Just please." James didn't touch the plate. His fingers curled against the edge of the table, his expression unreadable. A slow exhale escaped him as he finally stood up. Evelyn's smile faltered. "James," she said, her voice gentle, almost pleading. "You can't possibly believe this." James' gaze never left her. "I believe that something isn't right." A long silence followed. The tension in the room had changed, no longer quiet suspicion, but something darker. The air felt heavier, charged. Nathan's breath was unsteady. He knew his mother, knew how she could manipulate words, twist situations in her favor. He had seen it before, the way she always made herself seem like the victim, the way she had a way of making people doubt their own memories. But this time was different. James finally reached for the plate, but not to eat. Instead, he lifted it, studying the food with sharp, calculating eyes. Then in a slow, deliberate movement, he set it aside. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but there was something behind her eyes now. A flicker of something unreadable. "I'll have it tested," James said, his voice firm. Nathan felt the relief flood him, but it was short-lived. Evelyn took a slow step forward. "You don't trust me." James didn't answer. Another silence. And then Evelyn sighed. "Fine," she said softly. "I suppose I should have expected this." Before either of them could react, she reached down, grabbed the fork, and before anyone could stop her, took a single bite of the food. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. James stiffened. Evelyn chewed slowly, her gaze never breaking from her husband's. She swallowed, then placed the fork back onto the plate with a soft clink. "There," she murmured. "Now do you believe me?" Nathan felt his stomach twist. His mother stood there, composed, unshaken. But something about it was wrong. Very, very wrong. James hesitated, watching her. The room was silent again, but this time it was different, charged with something none of them could name. Nathan waited, his hands gripping the edge of the table. And then his mother smiled. It wasn't the warm, practiced smile she usually wore. It was something else entirely. Something colder. Something final. Nathan's blood ran cold. Because in that moment, as he watched her take a slow, deep breath, he realized something. She wasn't trying to prove her innocence. She was proving something else. And whatever it wasn't over. Nathan's heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. His mother stood there, composed, smiling in that way that sent chills down his spine. She had taken a bite. She had eaten the food. If there was poison, she should have reacted by now. So why wasn't anything happening? James' gaze never left her. His hands remained at his sides, tense but controlled. He was trying to read her, trying to make sense of the situation, but Nathan already knew. There was no making sense of Evelyn Caldwell. The room felt frozen in time, each second dragging out painfully long. Then slowly, Evelyn turned and picked up her wine glass, taking a delicate sip before setting it back down. She exhaled softly, as if the entire conversation had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Well," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face, "I suppose that settles it." Nathan couldn't shake the feeling in his gut. No, something wasn't right. His mother was always careful, always one step ahead. She had known exactly what she was doing in that kitchen. If she had poisoned the food, then she had also made sure she wouldn't suffer the consequences. His father seemed to come to the same realization at the same time. His eyes flickered toward the untouched glass of water by his plate, the only thing Evelyn hadn't taken a sip from. James reached for it. Evelyn moved fast, too fast. Before his fingers could close around the glass, she grabbed his wrist, her grip strong despite her delicate frame. Her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, the mask slipped. "Don't," she whispered. Nathan's breath caught. His father didn't move. Evelyn held his gaze for a long moment before slowly releasing his wrist. She exhaled, her shoulders relaxing. When she spoke again, her voice was calm, almost soothing. "You were never supposed to know," she murmured, shaking her head. "Neither of you." James straightened, his face unreadable. "Why?" His voice was steady, controlled. Evelyn let out a small, almost sad laugh. "Because it was never meant for you." She looked at Nathan now, her expression softening. "It was meant for me." Nathan's stomach turned. "What?" She sighed, stepping back, her fingers brushing the edge of the table. "I was never going to let you find out," she said, as if that made things better. "But Nathan," she paused, shaking her head, "you always were too observant for your own good." Nathan felt the world tilt slightly. His mother had poisoned the food for herself. James' expression hardened. "Why?" he demanded. Evelyn's gaze dropped to the plate, then to the glass of water. Her voice was quieter now, almost distant. "Because I was tired, James." She let out a breath, almost a whisper. "Tired of playing the perfect wife, the perfect mother. Tired of living in a house where I was nothing more than an accessory to your success." James stiffened. Nathan watched his father's jaw clench, his usual controlled expression threatening to break. Evelyn turned to Nathan now, her expression unreadable. "You were never supposed to see, sweetheart." A small, almost wistful smile crossed her lips. "You ruined my plan." Nathan swallowed hard, his chest tightening. His mother wasn't angry. She wasn't even upset. It was almost as if she had already accepted it, as if she had been ready to leave them behind. A long silence stretched between them. Then James took a slow step forward. "You need help," he said, his voice low but firm. Evelyn's eyes met his. "I needed a choice." Her voice didn't waver. But in this house, choices were never mine to make. The words hit harder than anything else she had said. James stood frozen, his face unreadable, but Nathan saw something flicker in his father's eyes. A moment of realization, of something unspoken finally clicking into place. For years, Evelyn had been the perfect wife, the elegant woman who stood by James' side at every event, smiled at every camera, and played the role everyone expected. But behind closed doors, she had been drowning. And no one had noticed, not until tonight. The weight of the moment settled heavily in the room. No one spoke. Finally, James exhaled, slow and deliberate. "Then let's fix this," he said. "Together." Evelyn stared at him. Nathan didn't know what he expected: anger, resistance. But instead, his mother's face softened. Just slightly, just enough. She looked at Nathan once more, something almost like regret flickering in her eyes. Then she let out a breath, nodded, and finally sat down. The storm had passed, but its weight lingered. That night, the plate was taken away. The water was untouched. And for the first time in years, the Caldwell family sat together, not as a picture-perfect family, but as people with wounds that needed healing. Nathan didn't know what the future held, but as he looked at his mother for the first time, he saw something real. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.